Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. The spooky Halloween season is upon us, so let's paint this vampire lord for Warhammer Age of Sigmar using contrast paints and a few tricks. After assembling the model, I primed it in my favorite method, beginning with a gray primer all over, followed by a zenithal style airbrush layer of white from the top and sides. Alternatively, you could undercoat the model with white or gray sear spray and get great results too. I'd like the skin to be a very pale grayish color, and I made a mix of equal parts Apothecary white and Mortarion grime. When using contrast paints, I like to work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then I'll use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the other areas. This color is light enough it shouldn't make a difference. Next I shaded the skin with Nuln oil. Rather than paint the shade all over the model, I painted it directly in the areas where I wanted deeper shadows, wherever the skin meets up against the armor, between the fingers, and in the creases on the face. Then I added some color around the eyes with a couple layers of Magos purple. Next I base coated the cloth with Shyish purple. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the chain here, since I'll be painting that with opaque paint later. But I want to do my best to avoid getting any paint on the skin, since that will be difficult to correct. This is a really dark, muted purple, almost black. I think a lot of people dislike this color because it isn't vibrant and it doesn't have a lot of depth. But I do think it's a really good base color if you spend a little more time and add some highlights to it, and we'll do some of that later. After the first layer dried, I painted a second coat for an even finish. I ended up making a couple mistakes here on the boot. I'll be painting that with black Templar, and that should be opaque enough to cover it up. With the black Templar still on my palette, I used a fine brush and painted a thin outline around the other remaining details. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Rather than continue on with contrast paints, let's move on to some opaque paints. Next I painted a few areas with Runelord brass. You could paint these in any order you like, but I find it easiest to paint the model from the inside out. This section of the armor is kind of hard to access, so it makes sense to paint it first, before painting the red armor above it. I find I make fewer mistakes by working this way. Then I shaded the brass with an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln oil. I painted the sword with Iron Hand steel. Then I shaded the sword with a thin layer of Nuln oil. The main purpose of this layer is to dull down the metal's shine, rather than to create dark shadows. After the Nuln oil dried, I reinforced the shadows with thinned black paint. I like to paint a gradation on the facets of blades, and alternate the placement of the deepest shadows. That way a dark shadow will be next to a bright highlight. It's not very realistic, but I think it looks more striking. I painted the baby dragon with Fenrisian gray, making sure to leave a thin black outline. Then I shaded the dragon with Gryph-Charger gray. Next I painted all the armor with Khorne red. I decided to go with an opaque paint for the armor rather than contrast paints. At this point the armor had a lot of spillover paint from the other sections, and in order to use contrast I'd have to touch it up with white first, which would take a lot more time than just painting it with an opaque red instead. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. With the red base coat looking smooth and even, I shaded it all over with a layer of Nuln oil. I'm trying to keep this layer thin and avoid excessive pooling. The goal with this layer is to create subtle shading. I'll add some deeper shadows next. Once the first layer of Nuln oil dried, I painted some more directly into the cracks, and in any areas where I wanted to deepen the shadows. There are a couple teeth hanging on this chain, and I painted those with Xandri dust. Then I shaded the top half of the teeth with Nuln oil. I base coated all the gemstones with Cantor blue. And then I painted the fangs and eyes with white. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to continue on with some highlights. Let's start off highlighting the fabric, beginning with some glazes of Screamer Pink. Thin the paint with about 3 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, add some thin layers on top of the folds. There should be very little paint coming off the brush, and it should dry pretty quickly. If the paint runs or flows off the brush, it means your brush is overloaded. The paint will look lighter while it's wet, and it will get darker as it dries. Build up a few layers, working progressively closer to the edges, and you should get a nice blended effect. I mixed a small amount of Fenrisian gray into the Screamer Pink and highlighted the edges. I'd like the first mix to be subtle, just a touch lighter, which I think will help give the fabric a softer look. I added some more Fenrisian Grey into the mix and highlighted once more, this time focusing on the most extreme edges and corners. I'm trying to keep this highlight very narrow and sharp, that way the fabric looks dark and not pink. Finally, I added some white to the mix and painted a few accents. I think it's really easy to overdo these, so make sure they're as narrow and as sharp as you can make them. A little will go a long way. I'd like to highlight the black boot in a similar kind of way, starting off with some thin glazes of Incubi darkness. Black Templar has a slight greenish tone to it, and I think this highlight color really complements it. I thinned the paint with about 3 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I started making some soft highlights. I want to have a real sharp highlight running along the front of the boot, so I'm trying to focus more of the paint there. For the first mix, I lightened the Incubi darkness with a small amount of Fenrisian Grey. Just like with the purple fabric, I want the first mix to be slightly lighter. I started off by defining the line along the front of the boot. Then I went back with some glazes and blended towards it. The brush will deposit more paint where it last touches the model, so I like to move the brush in the direction of the highlight. Next I mixed in more Fenrisian Grey and highlighted the sharpest edges and corners. This mix is a pretty big step up in value, so make sure to keep the lines sharp and narrow. Finally, I mixed in some white for a few bright reflections. Just like with the fabric, keep these as narrow and as sharp as possible. A little will go a long way, so if in doubt, paint less. You can always add more later. Moving on to the skin, I began with some subtle glazes of Grey number 7 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Grey Seer would be a close match. Contrast paint has a lot of variables, and so does the initial Zenithal Prime coat, so you may need to adjust the highlight color slightly. I got lucky with this gray being a near perfect match. Then I highlighted the skin with white. I thinned down the paint with plenty of water and added a few subtle highlights on the sharpest edges. Next I highlighted the little dragon with Fenrisian Grey. I used thin glazes for most of the highlights, followed by a few sharp highlights here and there. I mixed some white into the Fenrisian Grey and picked out a few of the sharpest edges and corners. Then I painted the webbing on the wings with a thin glaze of Magos purple. Next I highlighted the armor with Mephiston red, beginning with a soft glaze just like the other areas so far. Mephiston red is a strong color, so in order for the paint to be transparent enough, you'll want to dilute it with a little more water, maybe 4 parts water to 1 part paint. With barely any paint on your brush, paint some thin glazes on the raised areas of the armor. There should be barely any paint going on the model, and it should dry pretty quickly. Build up a few layers, gradually covering a smaller area each time, and you'll get a blended effect. I also used some less diluted paint and added a sharp highlight on the edges. I'd like to highlight the edges up through orange, and Wild Rider red is one of my favorite colors for building up to orange. I thinned the paint slightly and painted most of the edges of the armor. Then I highlighted the sharper edges with Fire Dragon. Try to make this line narrower than the line you made with Wild Rider red. That way it creates a blended effect on the edges. Finally, I mixed some toxic yellow into the orange and painted some very sharp highlights. I kept these reserved for the sharpest edges and corners. Just a few details left to paint, so let's move on to the sword. With some slightly thinned Iron Hand steel, I highlighted the blade. I want to reinforce the gradations I made earlier with the shades, so pay attention to where the shadows are and highlight the opposite areas. Then I picked out the edges with Stormhost silver. Next I painted the rivets on the armor with black. Then I painted them with Runelord brass, making sure to leave a thin black line around them. I'd like to add some oxidation to the brass, and it's really easy to do with some turquoise paint, thinned with water. With barely any paint on the brush, add some directly into the cracks. The paint will look brighter when it's wet, and it will darken as it dries. I think it's better to build up layers slowly. You can always add more, but if you add too much, it'll be difficult to correct. Next I highlighted the brass with an equal parts mix of Runelord brass and Stormhost silver. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Canoptic alloy is a close match. I prefer making this mix because it's stronger in pigment and I don't have to paint several layers. I highlighted the teeth on the belt with Bonewhite. Followed by pure white on the edges. I touched up the gemstones with a fresh coat of Cantor Blue. Then I highlighted the bottom half of each gem with Calidor Sky. Followed by Lothern Blue on the bottom fourth. Then I painted an equal parts mix of Lothern Blue and white on the bottom corner of each gem. And finally I painted a white dot on the top of each gem. I have a spare base from the Underworld's Crimson Court set, and I'd like to put the model on that. First I used some clippers and removed the skull. I undercoated the base with gray primer, and then I applied some textured paste with an old brush. Before the paste dried, I sprinkled on some fine sand and a few small rocks. I used tweezers to push the rocks down into the paste. I painted the base with a few different grays and brown washes. If you're interested in what colors I used, I'll post a recipe in the description down below. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I really enjoyed painting this vampire, especially the pale gray skin. I think it contrasts well against the other colors, especially that dark purple fabric. I think those two colors would make a nice alternative color scheme for Hive Fleet Leviathan Tyranids. What do you think? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting!